When it comes to being able to review or to see, and certainly to manage permissions in SharePoint, it's definitely going to depend on what your role and your permissions are. In this case, we're working as Michael Brooks, and Michael Brooks happens to be an administrator. But for most of us, we won't be administrators, we're just users at this point. So we're going to go out of the regular SharePoint team site and go into Michael's My Site, because all of you will have the permissions that Michael has in your own My Site. To do that, we'll move up to the name menu on the top right and simply click or tap About Me from the dropdown. Sometimes people get confused about where they can find settings, and it's important to remember that all of the settings for a site are under Site Settings. And whether you're on a My Site or a regular team site or any other kind of site, that's always the little gear in the upper right corner to the right of the name menu that we just used. If you expand this gear, you might be concerned that you don't see Site Settings. We have to make sure that we're in the right spot in a My Site. This is the About Me page. And technically, while it is a site, it's really not the type of functional parts of a site that we need to be in to see the options that we're looking for, because there's nothing that we can configure here. This is stuff that is configured on the server. Remember, we're talking about configuring lists and libraries and content and that kind of thing. So on the left-hand side of the screen, it doesn't really matter what you do, but we need to get into some of that content. I'm simply going to click on Apps. This is the equivalent of going to All Site Content in a team site. Now that we're into a regular part of the site, something that is more like a team site, if we go back to the gear on the top right, now we see the ability to access Site Settings. So first little hint is if you're in your My Site and you don't see Site Settings, you probably need to get to a list or a library. If, on the other hand, you're in a team site and you can't see Site Settings, that means you probably don't have permissions to do administrative work. We'll go ahead and give Site Settings a click, and we get into this wonderful screen that tells us all different kinds of things that we can do to administer our site. It really is a wonderful place, and it's not that I try to keep these things from you, but these are all of the things that we spend a lot of time going over in the Administrator series, how to be an SCA or a site administrator. So we're not going to talk about all of them, but I just wanted you to note that on the left-hand side, under Site Settings, under the Users and Permissions group, there's an option that says Site Permissions. This is where we can get an overview of everything that's happening in the site. What we get to see is a ribbon, and I'll tell you that this is the same ribbon that you would see even if you were administering this in a regular team site as an SCA or a site administrator. So it's exactly the same, this is just in your own personal site. The first thing to notice is how clean this is. Of course, Michael Brooks is a user, and it says that he's a user, and it also says that he has full control. It also has a group called Everyone Except External Users. Now, that kind of makes sense, but just to clarify, that would mean everybody in my organization, but not people outside of my organization. In other words, in this case, not people from the internet. That is a domain group, and you can see that they have read-only permissions. Now, the question is, how are these things applied within the site? Well, let's take a look at the ribbon and just kind of go through the options. We're going to move actually from right to left instead of left to right. You can find out who site collection administrators are by clicking on this option. You also can review Access Request Settings. And we'll go ahead and click on this because it's simple. It's not something you'll probably look at. But what this is saying is, if somebody tries to come to this site, in your case, or My Site, do you want to give them the option to request access if they are denied access? That means a screen would come up and simply say, you don't have permissions to enter this site. Do you want to send an email to the site owner and ask them for permissions? The default is to allow those requests. If you didn't want those kinds of emails, then you could take the check mark off. And of course, you can also designate to which email address the request should go. That's typically not something you worry about on a My Site, but again, these are features that carry over to the other types of sites, team sites as well. Now, let's look at something really interesting. We've talked about permission levels. Now let's see what permission levels there are. What we are now seeing are all of the different permission levels that have been defined on this site. In this case, it's a My Site, and they have not been customized at all. So these are kind of the defaults that you'll see in almost every instance of SharePoint. Full control is just that. That means this person would have all 33 permissions and they could do anything and everything they wanted to on a site. This is an administrator, a full administrator. There's a permission level called Design. There's one called Edit. One of the most commonly used ones for normal users is called the Contribute permission. That means they can view, add, update, and delete list items and documents, but they don't have any of those list permissions. They can't do any administrative types of work. Then, of course, there's the Read permission, which means they can view pages, but they can't add, edit, or delete, and certainly not administer anything. And then one called Limited Access, and that's something that the system uses. So this is where you can go and take a look at what permission levels are available. Technically, if you wanted to from here, you also could create new permission levels. But again, we don't cover that here. That's something for a different time and place. Let's go ahead and use the breadcrumb and go back to permissions so that we can get back to our ribbon. Another option that you have is the ability to check permissions. This is kind of a nice feature that was added a couple of versions ago. It lets you enter the name of a person or a group and find out what permission level they have at this level. In this case, it would be for Michael's entire My Site. So I'm just going to start entering my name. SharePoint gives us the list. We can click on a name in the list. We can click Check Now. It might take a few seconds or a minute or so, depending on how large and complex your system is. But what we can see is the permission levels given to Aaron Olson, and it does give me a little bit of an ID here, is given through the Everyone Except External Users. In other words, it recognizes that I am part of the domain and I am not coming from the internet. And that because I am part of that group, I have been given the read permission that we saw just a moment ago. Well, now we know what permissions I have. We'll go ahead and close it. And Michael might say, but I want Aaron to have more permissions than that. Maybe I'm Michael's supervisor. That's when we can move all the way to the left of the ribbon and we can choose to grant permissions. Who do you want to invite? Well, once again, SharePoint makes this easy, just like it was last time, by starting to type a name. Remember, I'm working with an individual, but normally you would prefer to work with groups. You select the name, you can write a personal message, and then I recommend that you show options, because this is where you get to designate what permission level they should have. If Michael gives me contribute permissions, it means on his My Site, I will be able to add, edit, modify, and delete content, as well as read everything, but I won't have any administrator privileges. He could give me read-only permissions, but I already have those. Or he could go all the way up and give me full control, give me as much control as he has. We'll go ahead and stick with the contribute permission, click on share, and in just a half a second or so, I will be receiving an email from Michael telling me that he's given me the permission level and a link to his site. It's really that easy to share. It also takes us through all of the capabilities that we have from the ribbon by accessing the permissions from site settings. What you now know is that permissions can be accessed from site settings. Site access requests can be turned on or off, and what permission levels are defined determines available permissions within a site, a list, a library, or even for individual elements. Checking a person's permissions for the current site identifies how they are classified and therefore what they can do. If you have permissions, you can assign others to groups to give them access to specific content. Remember, as a user and not as a full administrator, you will probably be limited in what you can do as far as permissions. Generally, unless you're an administrator, you can't do anything with permissions, unless, of course, you're in your My Site. This is just an overview of security or permissions basics so that you can understand how it works in SharePoint, how it's similar to what you're used to, and how you can do some basic things within your My Site. And remember that if you aren't confident modifying permissions, ask for help. You have lots of people that can help you do that, either your own SharePoint administrators or your IT department. It's too important to risk not doing it right. And if you want to learn more, we do cover it extensively in the Administering SharePoint course, just not part of this one. As a user, you now should be comfortable understanding how security and permissions work in SharePoint, to what permissions are applied, and even where you can go to take a look and see what you can find on your own.